Hello, and welcome to another FHIR for Developers tutorial video. My name is Gino Canessa, and today we're going to start an excursion into FHIR Search. There's quite a lot to cover. It'll probably take a few videos, but let's jump right in. I'm starting here on the core FHIR specification page, so just hl7.org/FHIR, and it has the welcome page. And fortunately for us, we can see under the Exchange tab right here up front our REST API plus search. Since we're looking at search, that seems like a good place to start. I will warn you up front that this documentation is the specification, and it's great once you're familiar with it. It's very easy to navigate once you understand how search works. It's not necessarily the most beginner-friendly. So as you're learning how the specification works, it'll be useful to be able to jump around a bit. Before we jump into that, I will note that we have maturity level normative and standard status normative here. So also very good news for anyone just learning how to work with FHIR Search is that it won't be changing out from under you. So this will be how search works for the foreseeable future. There are processes to make breaking changes to normative, but they're pretty high bars for something like search. So you can expect that how this works is how it will continue to work. As I'd mentioned, I'm actually going to jump over the summary table, and we'll come back to it here because after that is the introduction. Now, the search has two formats, two ways of going about it. One is a get and one is a post. People who are more familiar with REST in general are going to think of get and think that that makes the most sense. But I will caution that post is the official required way of searching. So almost every server I've come across does support get because it's actually simpler to work with, simpler to type into your web browser, different things like that. But post is the servers shall support to remain compliant. I'm going to use a little hidden knowledge right now and say this example isn't great because it doesn't actually have the post body. But if we look in the REST API section under search, we can see the same examples, but this one does have everything else filled out. So you can see that it's a post to this after the base type search. It does have the content type of form URL encoded, and then you just put the parameters as you would just like in the get. So the nice thing about using URL encoded is that it's the same. So the get and the post function the same, the things they return are the same, it's just a matter of what type of HTTP call you're making. So again, if you're more familiar with REST, usually search is a get. However, here there's the mandated version is a post. So what do you get back? Again, if you're familiar with REST, you would normally expect things like an array of patients if you were searching for a patient. However, in FHIR, we return a bundle. Now, we've used bundles before, and we've actually searched before, just in some of the basic things when we were looking for a patient to use and things like that. So I'm not going to spend too long here, but essentially there is this bundle type of search set, and that's saying that it's the response to a search. So having the bundle is very useful because there's a lot of metadata that can be included in it, and we'll go through each of those pieces here as we work through it. But there's things like these links that you can put in that allow you a nice mechanism for doing paging, different things like that. You have entries that have a search mode so that you can say things like this was a match and that's why it's here, or the server just included it, or this is an outcome saying there was some sort of error and we needed to tell you about it. Different things like that. So a lot of very useful metadata that can be included in the bundle, but if you're expecting just an array of patients, that is not what you're going to get back. So they're pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead, oops, I apologize, misclick there. Let's go ahead and try some so that we can see what it looks like. Here I'm just using Visual Studio Code with the REST client extension. There's another video that has all the explanations, so there'll be links to those if you need it. It's pretty straightforward. If you have Visual Studio Code, you install that extension, and then you have files with .http or .rest. And this function is similar to Postman if you're more familiar with that, or curl if you're familiar with that. In this case, we've defined a variable here just to make it easy if we want to change. I'm just using the public happy server so that we can do something that anyone can follow along with. So in this case, this triple hash is going to delineate different operation or different test that calls we want to make so that it can separate out things like contents versus new request. And so we'll just say get based search for patients, for instance. So as we said, and as we can see in our example here, I can even do this to start. We can see it's just get the base URL slash the type. So in this case, we have the FHIR URL, and the type we want is patient. And then we start putting parameters. If we don't want any parameters, such as we don't right now, then all we have to do is say accept, because we want application FHIR JSON back. Oops. We can say that, and we just click send request, and we get our response. I'm actually going to try and move, let's see how we do this. There we go. Move it like this so we can see a little better. Excuse me. So we can see we issued just a get to the patient endpoint, and we can see the server responded with a bundle that is a search set, as we mentioned, and it has some of these links. So the first one is the self link, and this one, if you're not familiar with, is a little odd because you're saying, well, obviously the self link is the thing that I called. We'll get into more detail, but really what it is what the server actually understood and processed. So when we start adding parameters, for instance, if there's a parameter the server doesn't understand, it won't show up in the self link. So that's a very important thing to check, and we'll get into that. In this case, we can see the server has done some paging because we have too many results, and so it does have the URL of the next link. So you can see here, get pages, and it has some UID, get offset is 20, count is 20, etc., etc. So it has this kind of, it's really an opaque link. In this case, it's a happy server implementation. So you can see they put a lot of these things in here. Some servers may just have an ID or something like that. However a server wants to do it. So there may be parsable things in here, there may not be, but it's not something that we can count on as a client. And then we have some entries. As we would expect, here we actually have the full URL and the resource within an entry. This has the actual patient. We can see that it's here because it was a match. And that's it. It just keeps going through and has a list of these. I know it's 20 just from reading our response here. And that's it. We could go and follow this link, this next link to get the next 20. So if we want to do a post, we can do the same thing. We'll delineate and do a post based search for patients. And in this case, we're just going to type up our same URL patient, but remember now we have this search. Same thing, we're going to want to accept application FHIR plus JSON. And then we actually want to set our content type to URL encoded. So application XWW form URL encoded. Because that, remember from the post, that's the MIME type that we need to send anything over with. Now in our case, we still don't actually have any parameters, so we can go ahead and just see, and we want to make sure we see this change. So that was 1653.08, and when we do a new one, we can see this was 1656.20. So it's obviously done our new request. And the contents are going to look amazingly similar because even though the query was done by post, it's exactly the same. You can see our next link is still URL. I'll note here there's no way to tell a server if this, or a client, if this is a get or a post. So a server has to support get and may accept post for getting the next pages and things like that as well. But you can see it's exactly the same type of thing. It's a search set bundle with the different patients in it, which is great. Except we probably don't want to ask the server every time for all the patients. So we need to start looking at parameters. Now, there's a few different types of parameters. And now is when we're going to jump back up to the summary table. We'll start up here. So the first thing we want to see is this parameters for all resources. So these are things that the FHIR specification said, these parameters make sense on any resource the server supports. Things like ID. You can do, obviously, if you just get, patient /123, and there's a patient with that ID, you can get that back. But you can also format your search, and I'll switch back to get just for simplicity here. Oh, maybe not. There we go. So if we wanted to say we were pulling patients, and instead of just making up an ID, why don't I use an actual ID here? So we can get this patient, right? We can just send this request, and we get back a patient. However, we can also do something like this, ID equals. Now, instead of getting the patient, this was a search telling us that it was this patient ID. And so we can see we got back a bundle, and it has one patient in this case, total 1. Why you would want to do that is because now we can start doing more, because this is a search that's returning a bundle, so we can start asking for more things, which we'll get into probably in actually a different video. But you can include other resources and different things like that. So it's very useful to be able to say I'm searching for this patient, this resource, whatever it is. Just so we can see down here, when we put the body, I believe it's just the same thing, isn't it? When we come here, we search, and same thing. Yep. So in this case, we're telling it this is the post body that it actually includes. And so you can see it did the same thing and returned a bundle with one patient. So we can see that it has ID, tag, profile, security, all kinds of things that would make sense on any resource. I will take this opportunity to say these are things that are defined for all resources. Servers do not have to implement them. Very few things in FHIR are must implement or shall support, things like that. As I mentioned, post-based search is one. If you have implemented search on a particular resource, you do have to support post. However, that doesn't mean you have to support a given resource, and it doesn't mean that you have to support searching on that resource. So it's very generic, because healthcare has a lot of use cases, and they want to make sure that FHIR works for all of them. So just because it's defined does not mean it is supported. And we'll go through how to get that shortly. So in addition to these parameters for all resources, we do have these search result parameters. These are things that are affecting how the data is returned. So for instance, sorting, if you want to tell it, and again, if we click on these, it'll take us to more definitions, but you can see we're telling it fields that we want to sort by and things like that. Same thing for count. That's pretty self-explanatory. Include and reverse include, and again, we'll dive into more of those in probably in their own video actually, but it's just to add additional related resources. Summary is a good one if you're doing kind of more generic type clients and you don't want every single detail in a given resource. The resource definitions have, and we'll just use this one and change over to patient. And we've talked about this when we're reading the spec, but they have this flag to say if it should be included in a summary or not. So you can see in patient, a lot of these fields, these things like name and gender and date of birth, those are all things that if you're getting a patient, you're going to want those. But things like photos and contact info, if I'm just trying to show a list of patients or someone to pick from, I don't necessarily need their photos or contact info. So you can say, just give me the summary. I'll jump here to say elements is a similar type thing. You can actually specify saying, you know what, I do want their photo because I'm showing a list with pictures. And so really I could just specify saying I want their patient's name, gender, birth date, and photo. And that would be a set you could do. Again, if a server supports it. So you can see these are things that change what you're getting. There's also a few extras that are not in this table, and they're defined in this list right below it. Kind of the ones that are good examples are the format and pretty. So just here when we had said we want FHIR JSON, what you can actually do is do something like format equals application FHIR plus JSON here. And then, well, we can actually do FHIR plus XML so that we can see which one wins. There you go. And the one that's in the URL actually overrode the MIME type that we were asking for because we specifically told the server we want FHIR XML. So you can see things like that. Pretty printing, again, that's formatting. So these have nothing to do with a search in general. They can actually be used the same thing when you're just getting a patient or anything like that. But they're always defined, and again, not necessarily supported. So I don't remember the rules on format and pretty as far as implementation rules, but this is great for everything that's common. So we can see this is going to cover a lot of use case for very specific things. That we're looking for the text or the ID, that we know the ID or different things like that. But again, when we wanted to look for a patient, we probably know the patient's name, and that's not going to show up here. So what we do is come back to the patient, and I should actually navigate to it so that everyone can see. If you're not as comfortable with the FHIR standard, generally speaking, if you're looking for a resource, you can just add it in the URL. But if you're looking for it, you just go through resources, and then we have a bunch of different formats of the list, categorized, alphabetical, by maturity, things like that. So in our case, we know we're looking for the patient. Actually, categorized might be a good one to see. So you can see like the base has patients and practitioners and things like that. So these are kind of grouped together, and then you can see the maturity levels as well. So patient is normative, and we can just click that and come through to the patient. So here, again, this is just all the information about the patient resource. But if we go all the way to the end, there's something called search parameters. And these are the parameters that we can include with a search in order to narrow what we're looking for. So every resource defines these for that resource. Implementation guides can also define additional ones, things like that. I will again note, just because it's defined doesn't mean it's implemented. So you do have to go and look, and we'll get to that here. Actually, we'll do that right after this. But you can see in this case for patient, these are all the ones that are specific to this resource. So if I'm looking for a patient by name, excuse me, we can see it has an explanation. I'll note that this text is incorrect and has already been fixed in the next release. But it's just saying it'll search anything in the human name, family name, given name, prefix, suffixes, text, all those things. As opposed to, for instance, if you just look at family name, it will just match the family name on the patient. Now, these types relate here. We can see that each of the search parameters has a type. Now, when we're typing things in a URL bar or posting URL encoded, everything's a string in reality as far as what things will get. And so these types, when we look, kind of give you all the interpretation you need for each of these types. So that's this last part of the summary table. And I believe if we click on them here, yes, it does take us to the search page for that type. So for instance, when we come to name, we can see the details of what a string search means. And in our case, the default of a string search is starts with case insensitive. So you can see there's the explanation of that and some examples. If you put, in this case, they're using given instead of just the name parameter, but you can see if you start with Eve, you get Eve and Evelyn. If you get a contains, then it's anywhere, also case insensitive. But once you switch to exact, it is exact and it is case sensitive. And then there's different ways that we can keep expanding on that. And we'll get into more details and more examples here. So you can see that it has all these different things here. So how do you know what you can actually use? If you're just working, tinkering, developing, or if you're developing against a particular server, a lot of it, I'll say, is probably trial and error is going to be simple. But something we've done before is this get metadata. So we'll copy this request because it's pretty simpler, or pretty similar. But what we're going to do is get the metadata. And this is going to get the capability statement for the server. There we go. It's a little slow because it is a big set of stuff. We've looked at these before when we looked at kind of the intro to talking to a FHIR server. But the capability statement here, we can do the same thing. Come to resources. And it's actually the first one here in Foundation, capability statement. This is what's at that metadata endpoint. And so, again, I'm not going to go through the entire spec here, but you can see the resource tree is pretty good to navigate. And this just explains what a server actually has. Now, again, it's not a guarantee that in your user session even you will be able to do this. So the server might say, oh yeah, I generally support writing patients. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily can as that particular client. Some servers will go through and do the capability statement custom to what your user permissions look like at the time. Some won't, but this will give you a general idea. And again, things like that generally aren't too big a deal because if you're developing software that wants to, for example, write a patient, you would need to handle errors there anyway. So in some cases, it's nice to know up front. In some cases, it's not possible to know. But in our case, there's this REST section, and then it goes through and talks about, with resources, what different operations and things are allowed. And one of them is search parameters. So if I go look at patient, let's see. That's not what we want. We want something like, what's the field here? Type, right? Yes, type. So we actually want type, and that is patient. There we go. So we can jump down to our patient resource. We can see that the profile is the base patient. It does support a lot of additional profiles. Again, this is the public test server, so a lot of people add things to it. The interactions, again, we've talked about those in a different video, but you can see we do have this search type, which is saying that we can search on the type of this resource. And that's what we've been doing, is saying we want to search all patients. So that's the type there. That's why that's there. Search includes. So this, again, we'll get into includes and reverse includes, but it's basically saying, you know, if you want to include other resources in the results, these are the ones that the server supports. And we'll dive into that more because it's fairly complicated. Once we scroll through all of those, we can get to what we were looking for, which is search parameters. And so this is the list of the search parameters that the server actually supports for this resource. So most of these you can see are just going to be the search parameters that we were looking at on the patient page. So birth date was the first one here, and you can see that there's birth date here, just like it is here. And you'll notice the casing even, the search parameter has birth date all lowercase, which matches what it is here, birth date, lowercase. Even though the field itself, birth date, you can see is kind of, what is that, lower camel case. So that's how you can tell it's not referring to the field, it's referring to the search parameter. And it has, you know, the link to the definition. It has some documentation about it, so you can display those things to users if they're interested, etc. It also has the type, so you can use that to determine what kinds of modifiers and things like that you can do within the search. So the ones with the underscores are the ones that we were talking about that are defined more generically. So you can see things like, in our case, the first one with the underscore was the last updated. So it's saying when was the resource version last changed. And you can see that's one that's defined here. Resources themselves are not allowed to define ones with the underscores like that. So anything like that is going to be a generic kind of server level FHIR defined thing. So you can see this is how you can go and discover for a particular resource what's allowed. And so I'll see if there's any here. So far, these are all ones that are defined in the core FHIR spec. But I'm guessing we'll have some eventually. That patient is probably one of the harder ones. There you go. So like this. This has an operation called everything. Oh, we skipped out of search parameters and right into operations. Okay, so there were no search parameters that were not FHIR defined ones here. So if there were, so for instance, an implementation guide, if they added a search parameter and they wanted to support it, then it would just show up here and the definition link would point to somewhere else. Perfect. So I think that kind of covers the basics of, we should, yeah, that's probably, given how long this video has gotten already, again, there's a lot to cover with search, so it's going to take a few episodes here to get through everything. So next time we'll probably jump into the different search parameter types before we start getting into some more of the more advanced things with includes and reverse includes and things like that. So thanks for watching. Again, if this content helps, please let me know. If there's something you feel like I've missed or would be helpful to cover, please let me know that as well. And if not, I will see you next time. Thanks. Cheers.